Captured killings. The killer who records his crimes. The room was silent. A faint hum from the old fridge in the corner. But it didn't matter.
He wasn't focused on that.
The air was thick, heavy. A stench of something metallic lingered.
Blood.
He stood by the desk. His fingers were slick, trembling. He wiped them on his shirt. The camera sat in front of him. Small, black. Unassuming. It had been his companion for weeks now. The lens cold and unblinking. Always watching. He pressed the button. A low beep. The screen lit up. It wasn't his first. It wasn't even his second. But it felt different tonight. Something was wrong. A sound from behind. A creak of the floorboards. A breath caught in the air. He didn't turn around. His eyes stayed on the screen. But his heart pounded in his chest.
He zoomed in.
The figure on the monitor shifted, twitching in the dim light. A sharp gasp. A breath too loud. Too close. It wasn't just the video. It was the room. It was her. He knew that smell. That perfume. Her voice haunting him. I thought you'd never finish. She was standing right behind him now. He could feel her. Her presence was suffocating. He swallowed hard. He couldn't move. He couldn't even blink. Her fingers brushed his neck.
Cold.
Like ice. Do you like what you've created? Her voice was sweet, mocking. He clenched his fists. But his body was frozen. He couldn't escape her. The video continued to play. But it wasn't a recording anymore. It was live. She had somehow connected to it. He wanted to scream. But his throat was dry, constricted. The screen flickered. She stepped closer. Is this your masterpiece? She whispered. Her lips were too close. Too cold against his ear. Something snapped. The camera hit the floor. And the world went dark. The room plunged into darkness. His pulse hammered in his ears. His breath came in quick, shallow gasps. He couldn't move.
He couldn't think.
The silence felt suffocating. It wrapped around him like a vice.
Tight.
Tighter. The smell of blood lingered, stronger now. Then, a faint light. A glow in the distance. A screen flickered to life. His body refused to obey. His mind screamed. But he was paralyzed. The monitor showed nothing at first. Just static. But then, a face appeared. Her face.
Cold.
Unblinking.
Smiling.
The same smile that had haunted his nightmares. Her eyes were wide, unblinking. Her lips stretched unnaturally. Too wide. Did you really think you could escape? Her voice slithered from the speakers. Soft and venomous. He tried to scream. But nothing came out. She was still there. Her smile growing. Stretching. He could feel her presence now. Right behind him. Her breath on his neck. Her fingers tracing his spine. He closed his eyes. But the image of her was burned into his mind. Sharper than ever. The screen flickered again. And then he saw it. The bodies. The ones he'd left behind. The ones he'd forgotten. They were moving. Their eyes now open. Staring at him.
He gasped.
His heart skipped a beat. He could hear them. Their muffled whispers. Their cries. One by one they stood. Emerging from the shadows. Their twisted forms coming into focus. They were real. Not just recordings. Not just ghosts. They were here. They were alive. And they were angry. He tried to back away. But there was nowhere to go. The walls closed in. Her voice rang out again. Closer this time. I hope you're ready for your next recording. He turned, desperate. But there was nothing there. Nothing but the growing darkness. And the faint glow of the screen. Then the lights flashed. And everything went black. The blackness was overwhelming. It swallowed him whole. No sound. No breath. Nothing but the void. And then, a sudden, sharp pain in his chest. A cold, metallic pressure. Like fingers gripping his heart. His vision blurred. His head spun. He gasped, trying to fill his lungs with air. But it wouldn't come. The pressure tightened. Tighter. Tighter. His mouth opened, but no words came. Only a strangled wheeze. A flicker of light. The screen again. The glow was faint, but unmistakable. He could hear it now. A voice. Her voice. "Don't worry," she said. Her tone light, almost playful. "I'll make sure you're recorded." Just like the others, her figure appeared on the screen. Not just her face this time,
but her whole body.
Standing, watching, waiting. She moved. The camera in her hands, a mirror to his own. She raised it, focused it on him. The lens was cold against his skin. He could feel the weight of it. He could feel her watching him, watching everything. Her lips curled into that same cruel smile. And then, she whispered, "Your final masterpiece." And he realized too late. He was the one being filmed now. The screen flickered again. A blur of motion.
He could feel it now.
The cold steel against his throat. The gentle pressure. Was it her hands? No, it couldn't be. He turned his head in panic. But he saw nothing. Then, a sudden flash of clarity. A vision. A reflection. It was him. He was recording himself. The camera was angled toward his own face. The pressure on his throat loosened. He choked for air.
Gasped. Desperate.
But his body wouldn't respond. And the camera kept rolling, the lens never stopped. It stared at him. Cold. Unfeeling. His hands trembled. His vision was fading. The room spun, blurry, distorted. A sharp gasp. A cold sweat dripped down his forehead. But he couldn't move. He couldn't stop it. The camera captured it all. Every second. Every painful breath. He could feel the darkness creeping in. Not just from the lack of light, but from the emptiness inside him. And then, that voice again. Whispering through the speakers. "You're not the first. But you'll be the last." Her words wrapped around him. A death sentence. A confession. He wanted to scream. To fight. But his body wouldn't obey. A heavy silence filled the room.
Thick.
Like a suffocating blanket. And then, the sound of footsteps.
Slow.
Measured. He tried to focus. Tried to force his limbs to move. But the darkness, it was pulling him under. Her figure appeared, once more on the screen. But this time, she wasn't smiling. Her eyes were wide. Empty. Piercing through him. Her lips moved slowly. "Now we record the last act. Your final performance." He felt something.
Cold against his skin.
Metal. A knife. Her face came closer. Closer than before. Her fingers brushed his cheek. Her touch was ice. Burning through him. He wanted to scream. But no sound came. Her eyes never left his. Never blinked. They were full of something. Something he couldn't name. The cold blade pressed against his skin. She leaned in. Her breath hot and sharp. And then, she whispered one last time. "I hope you make a good recording." The blade sliced through his throat. The camera kept rolling, the screen blinked back to life. For a moment it was empty. Just static. Then the image appeared. His face.
Pale.
Lifeless. But something was wrong. The camera didn't stop there. It zoomed in, closer, closer. And in the reflection of his wide, staring eyes, she was there. Not behind him. Not beside him. But staring back from the screen. Her face twisted in the glass of his vacant stare. The faintest flicker of movement. Her hand, creeping from the shadows. Reaching toward him. It wasn't a dream. It wasn't a trick of the light. She was there.
Alive.
And she wasn't just in the recording. She was with him. Inside the room. The camera captured it all. Captured her. As she stepped from the shadows. Closer. Closer. Her smile twisted into something grotesque. Her eyes gleamed with triumph. "You thought you were the artist. The creator," she whispered, her voice seeping into the very air around him. "But you were just another victim." Her fingers brushed against the lens, touching the camera. The reflection of her hands, of her face, appeared to ripple in the glass. Then a sudden sound. A snap. A crack. The camera fell. The lens shattered, scattering on the floor. And in the flickering chaos of broken glass, she was gone. For a moment, everything was still. The room was silent. But the darkness never left. And neither did the sense of watching eyes. The recording had stopped, but the feeling lingered. Her presence, it stayed. A shadow that never fully faded. And as the final breath of the killer was captured in the last moments of that chilling film, there was a final thought that passed through his fading mind. This wasn't the end. It was just another beginning. The silence hung in the air like a thick fog. But it wasn't empty.
No.
There was something there. Something lingering. Something watching. The shattered camera lay on the floor. Its lens cracked. Its image frozen. But the feeling? That sensation of eyes? It didn't go away. And then, the lights flickered.
Once. Twice.
A low hum came from the dark corner of the room. A small, faint glow in the distance. It was the screen. The one he'd left on. The one he never turned off. His heart thudded. The blood still stained his clothes. Still warm. Still fresh. But that wasn't what made him shiver. It was the glow of the screen. The screen that was no longer showing just static. No longer showing his final moments. No longer showing the empty room. It was showing something else now. A face. Her face. But this time, it wasn't on the screen. It was in the room with him. Her figure stood in the doorway, dark and undefined at first. Then, her smile slowly materialized in the shadows. It was wider than before. Deeper. As though it could swallow him whole. He wanted to run. To scream. But his legs wouldn't move. His body was a hollow shell. Her voice broke the silence, once more. I told you, you'd never escape. Her fingers stretched toward him. Elongating, twisting. Slowly, like a predator savoring its prey. Her eyes gleamed in the dark. But they weren't the eyes of a human. Not anymore. There was no warmth in them. No compassion. Only cold, endless hunger. The space around him grew tighter. The walls seemed to shift, closing in with every breath he took. The air was thick. He couldn't breathe. Her hand reached for him, fingers grazing his skin. Cold. Frostbitten. He closed his eyes, tried to fight. But her whisper, soft and deadly, slipped through the darkness. You'll never be alone again. The lights went out. And in that final, choking moment, he realized the recording had never ended. It had only begun. The darkness swallowed him whole. His mind was spinning. Fuzzy.
Disoriented.
But the cold never left. Her presence. It clung to him like a shadow. A heavy, suffocating weight. He opened his eyes.
Barely.
The room was pitch black. But he could feel it. She was still there. Her breath against his neck. Her fingers brushing his skin. A low whisper echoed through the air. You're mine now. The words crawled under his skin. Tighter. Tighter. The silence was broken only by the faint hum of the fridge, its low buzz distant, almost soothing. But nothing about this moment felt safe. He tried to move. His body was heavy, frozen, like it had been locked in place. Something was stopping him. A weight on his chest. A pressure that wasn't physical, but deep inside, in his very soul. And then, the light flickered again. The same faint, eerie glow. It illuminated the room for a split second. But it wasn't just the room it showed. It was the reflection of him. He wasn't alone. Her face was in the glass, staring back at him. Her eyes, familiar yet foreign. Her mouth twisted into a smile that wasn't hers. She was inside him now. He could feel it. The reflection of his own face. The one he saw in the darkened screen. It wasn't his anymore. Not entirely. He could feel the cold of her fingers now, deep inside his chest. Not just touching. Not just holding him. But in him. Like she had become part of him. The screen flashed again. But it wasn't showing him anymore. It showed something else. A different scene. A room he didn't recognize. A space full of shadows and whispers. A place where people screamed, but no one heard. And, in the corner of the room, a camera. Small. Black. And blinking. He wanted to scream. Wanted to shout. But his voice was gone. Her hand. Her fingers curled into the reflection of his chest. Pulling. dragging. And suddenly, it wasn't his reflection anymore. It was hers. Her face twisted and stretched, the smile widening, her eyes burning through him. The camera blinked, and he understood. This was what she wanted. Not just his death, but his soul. The recording hadn't been for her. It had been for him. The screen buzzed again, and as the light flickered out, he knew he was no longer in control. And she was never going to leave.
Not now.
Not ever. The room was suffocating now. The air thick and heavy with something unnatural. He couldn't breathe, couldn't move. It was like her presence had seeped into every corner of the room. Her fingers still curled around his chest, twisting, pulling. The pain wasn't just physical anymore. It was deep. In his mind, in his very soul. His thoughts were slipping away, sliding into the void, like the final frame of a film, fading into black. And then, a sound. A low, distorted hum. The screen, still flickering, buzzing at the edge of his vision. The camera. It was back. But this time, it wasn't just recording. It was watching him, staring, tracking his every move. But he wasn't moving. Not anymore. The camera's lens was fixed on him, and he knew she was watching. Her eyes, cold and endless, burned into him through the glass. She whispered again, her voice seeping into his ears like a slow poison. Look at yourself. Look at what you've become. His gaze locked on the screen, and for the first time, he saw it, the truth. It wasn't just his body that was gone. It was his soul. He saw his reflection, but it wasn't his face staring back. It was hers. Her smile stretched wide, too wide, a grin that seemed to split her face in two. Her eyes burned, and his hands, his own hands, were moving, but not by his command. He tried to scream, but his mouth wouldn't open. His body was a shell, a puppet. His reflection was moving of its own accord, twisting, bending, as though it was alive. She was in him, and, in that moment, he realized the horror. The recording hadn't been the end. It had been the beginning. A cycle, a trap. He had never been the creator. He had never been the master. He was the victim, the pawn in her game. And now, he was her instrument. His body jerked, his hands reaching for the camera, but it wasn't him anymore. It was her. She was inside him, controlling him. The lens focused. It zoomed in on his face. The last thing he saw was the reflection of her smile, wider than ever. Before everything went dark, the darkness was crushing, heavy, unyielding. His thoughts were a blur, a swirl of confusion and terror. He wanted to scream. He tried, but his mouth wouldn't move. His body wouldn't listen. The silence was deafening, but there was something else. A faint buzzing in the distance. The hum of the broken camera. Still recording. He could feel the coldness creeping up his spine. It wasn't just in the room anymore.
It was inside him.
Her voice. Her whisper. It was everywhere. In his ears. In his mind. You thought you could escape. She murmured, her words slithering into his thoughts. You thought you were in control. His body jerked again. Against his will. His hands raised, as if pulling himself toward something. But he wasn't in control.
She was.
The reflection in the shattered lens was not his. It was hers. Her eyes, wide and unblinking, staring back at him from the glass. The screen flashed again. His face. No, her face, stared back, twisted in that grotesque smile. The edges of his vision blurred.
Was this it?
Had he crossed the line? Had he become nothing more than a vessel for her? It felt like a dream. Or maybe a nightmare. A dream he couldn't wake up from. The camera blinked. The light flickered. And then, the screen changed. It wasn't showing his reflection anymore. It was showing the room. But it wasn't the room he knew. It was different. More distorted. The walls were moving. Shifting. Stretching. Like they were alive. And then, another figure appeared on the screen.
A man.
The face was blurry at first, but it became clearer with each passing second. Another victim. He recognized the figure. He knew that face. It was him. But not the him he remembered. It was the him that had been consumed.
Taken.
Her influence had stretched beyond his body. She was rewriting everything. She was remaking him. And then the final twist. The man on the screen reached out, reached toward the lens. Not with fear, but with the same cruel smile. "Welcome," he whispered. "Welcome to the show." And the camera continued to record. Endlessly. Because it had never been about the murders. It had always been about the performance that the camera never stopped. The screen blinked again, showing the man, his reflection, but not him anymore. It was something else. Her. She was inside him now, her face twisted in his features, her smile stretching far beyond the limits of what should have been possible. It wasn't a grin. It was a snare, a trap, pulling him deeper into her world. His eyes, wide and unblinking, stared back at him, but they weren't his eyes. They were hers. The screen shimmered. Then the room shifted again. The walls seemed to melt, distorting, stretching, becoming something dark, something unreal. Shapes moved within the shadows, unseen, but always there, always watching. He tried to scream, but his throat was dry, his voice swallowed by the same darkness that was now inside him. Her voice, calm and knowing, slithered through his mind again. "You are me now." Her words echoed in his head, a chorus of whispers from every direction. "You will never escape me." His hands moved without his command. His body jerked in twisted motions, as if strung together by invisible wires. He was nothing but a puppet, nothing but a vessel for her. The camera's lens clicked, capturing every moment, every twitch, every grimace. Then the figure on the screen, the distorted reflection of him, smiled again. It wasn't the cruel smile of a victim. It wasn't the smile of someone who had been taken. It was hers. The smile that had once been an image in a screen, now stretched across his own face. He could feel it now. The pull. The weight. Her cold fingers inside his mind. He wasn't just trapped in a room anymore. He was trapped in her. The camera's light flickered. The lens caught the faintest glimpse of something else. A door opening, but not a door he had ever seen before. It was dark, and from it, shadows poured, swarming toward him. But it wasn't just the shadows. It was them, the victims, the ones he had thought were gone.
They were standing in the doorway now,
Each of them, pale, hollow-eyed, their faces staring at him. And behind them, she was there, her face now fully formed, her eyes shining. She wasn't just inside him. She had become him. "You were never the creator," she whispered, her voice echoing in his head. "You were always the creation." The camera's lens clicked one final time, and then everything went black. But the recording continued, the lens capturing the empty room, the shadows lingering, and the faintest sound of her laughter, slowly fading into nothing. Endlessly, the room felt colder now. Not the cold of an ordinary night, but the chill of something far worse. Something unnatural. The walls, once solid and real, now pulsed with an eerie rhythm, as if they were breathing.
In, out, in.
The shadows stretched longer than they should have, crawling toward him like hungry tendrils. He tried to move, to escape, but his limbs were frozen, locked in place by a force far beyond his control. Her presence was inside him, a presence that filled every empty space in his mind. Her voice, soft but suffocating, whispered to him from every corner of the room. "You'll never be alone." His breath quickened. His heartbeat raced. But no matter how hard he tried, his body wouldn't respond. The door, once shut and forgotten, now creaked open, not from wind, not from time, but from her. The shadows behind it stirred. Figures moved in the darkness. But they weren't just shadows. They were the faces of the dead, of the ones he had killed. They stepped forward, their eyes hollow and cold, their lips frozen in silent screams. Each step they took reverberated through the room, like a death knell. And then, she emerged from the shadows, her smile now wider than ever, her eyes gleaming with cold satisfaction. "You thought you could leave," she said, her voice thick with venom. "But I've made you part of this story now. You are the story." Her fingers, long and skeletal, reached out to touch him, and his body jerked forward, as though his bones had been ripped from the marrow.
Pain.
Excruciating pain. But it wasn't just physical. It was the pain of being trapped, of being consumed. He was no longer a man. He was a memory. Her fingers tightened, sinking into his chest, and he felt his soul tear away, a final scream frozen in his throat. The camera clicked, and then the world went silent. The silence hung in the air, thick and oppressive. The room had returned to its unnatural stillness. But it was different now. There was no more hum of the camera, no more flickering of lights. Everything was still, but it wasn't the stillness of peace. It was the stillness of finality. His body, limp and lifeless, rested in the center of the room. But his eyes, they were still open, still staring, not at the walls, not at the door, but at the dark screen in front of him. The camera had stopped recording. Its lens was cracked, the shattered glass reflecting the faintest traces of light. But it was no longer needed. What had been captured, what had been recorded, had already transcended the boundaries of the screen. He had become the final entry, the last frame in a story that never truly ended. The room, once a place of torment, now felt strangely empty. Not empty, as in vacant. Empty as in hollow. Devoid of meaning. The shadows that had once haunted the corners of the space were gone. The whispers in the air, the cold presence that had tormented him, faded into nothingness. She was gone. But was she truly gone? Or had she merely become part of the room? A part of the story that would never stop playing. A story recorded, replayed, and never erased? He didn't know. And perhaps, in the end, it didn't matter. He had become the last victim, the final sacrifice. And in that moment, he understood. The killer who recorded his murders. He had never been the one behind the camera. He was always the one being watched. The cycle would continue. It would never end. The screen remained dark, its glow long extinguished. But the story would never stop playing.